The very sound of the word Vikings instantly conjures powerful images: giant, hardened warriors and fearless seafarers, whose nature was woven from equal parts unparalleled courage and primal barbarism. They originally inhabited the harsh lands of Scandinavia, territories now known as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The rugged mountain landscapes of their homeland, from the earliest stages of their history, shaped a people whose gaze was invariably fixed outwards, beyond familiar horizons. With the onset of the early Middle Ages, these brave seafarers began to guide their light yet sturdy longships out of sheltered fjords, tirelessly scanning the sea. Their goal was not only to discover new, rich lands and establish trade routes, but also, to the horror of continental inhabitants, to mercilessly terrorize the unfortunate Europeans who dared to stand in their way. For over 500 years, these intrepid conquerors swept across Europe, extending their influence eastward, southward, and westward. A particular direction of their expansion lay to the west, where Norwegian Vikings, like an unstoppable wave, gradually traversed the boundless expanses of the Atlantic Ocean. Their path led from the British Isles, then through the harsh waters of Iceland and Greenland, until, finally, it reached a mysterious place they called Vinland. Today, almost every schoolchild knows this astonishing story. It was the rebellious Viking named Leif Erikson who set foot on the soil of the New World long before Christopher Columbus's famous historical voyage forever changed the world map. However, until recently, it remained a deep mystery how these Scandinavian seafarers managed to accomplish such an incredible navigational feat. Disputes still rage about whether they made real attempts to colonize American lands and how masterfully they commanded their complex, seafaring art. Researchers who have dedicated themselves to sailing small, open replicas of their ancient vessels invariably develop the deepest respect for these people. They were not merely brave, they undoubtedly possessed outstanding intellect in shipbuilding, navigation, and seamanship. Their organization and discipline aboard the ships also deserve admiration. Overall, their achievements seem truly fantastic. Among those who have deeply understood Viking maritime customs, Ragnar Sorens from Norway stands out. For the past decade, he has fully dedicated himself to an ambitious project, building accurate replicas of Viking ships and subsequently sailing them around the world. His research aimed to obtain the most complete information about the seaworthiness, speed, and, of course, the handling skills of these ancient vessels. The goal is simple yet grand: to better understand how the Vikings managed not just to cross the North Atlantic once, but to regularly undertake these dangerous journeys 1,000 years ago. The archaeology of these unique ships is a relatively young and constantly evolving field in the study of the past. Working in close cooperation with leading scholars from Viking ship museums in Norway and Denmark, Ragnar Sorens strived to remain as faithful as possible to the original craft of Viking shipbuilding, recreating every detail with meticulous precision. One of the unique features of Scandinavian shipbuilding of that time is the so-called clinker-built technique, or labstrake construction. Unlike most modern ships where hull planks are laid edge to edge, in Viking ships, they were laid overlapping and then securely fastened with special nails. This method was fundamentally different. Shipbuilding began with the labstrake planking, and only then were the ribs installed, whereas in most other shipbuilding traditions of that time, the sequence of actions was exactly the opposite. Ragnar Sorens's fleet represents an impressive collection of meticulously recreated replicas of famous Viking ships. Among them is the majestic Gaia, an exact copy of the largest Viking ship ever found. Another vessel, Milton, dating to approximately 850 AD, is a typical raiding ship, which, in all likelihood, once belonged to the king himself, emphasizing its significance and combat readiness. Oseberg is an elegant replica of a royal yacht built around 800 AD, rightly considered the most elegant of all known Viking ships due to its refined forms and rich ornamentation. Additionally, this unique fleet includes a vessel known as Masaga CD, which is almost a seaworthy training ship of 11th century Vikings. Researchers note that if they were faced with the task of crossing the North Atlantic again, they would prefer a ship capable of withstanding the harsh trials of the ocean, although the specific name remains unclarified. However, if it were a speed competition, similar to the America's Cup, the choice would undoubtedly fall on Gaia, a truly magnificent, fast ship capable of astonishing with its dynamism. The history of the Vikings' large-scale expansion is inextricably linked with the unique characteristics of the lands they inhabited and the specific conditions that formed in those regions. Faced with this pagan horde, which wielded battle axes and swords with terrifying skill, Europe found itself virtually helpless. The Vikings saw no reason to spare civilians, women, or children during their swift and brutal attacks, leaving behind a trail of destruction and fear. Their courage and hunger for new lands led them far south, even to Spain, and perhaps sometimes they even ventured into the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, extending the boundaries of their influence to previously unthinkable limits. In the 9th century, their power reached such a scale that they successfully plundered London and even besieged impregnable Paris, shocking the major European powers. They also actively settled parts of Ireland, northern England, and, in particular, conquered and fortified the city of York. Modern research has completely changed the established perception of the Viking Age, especially in the context of York. Previously, many believed that Vikings only came to destroy and devastate cities. However, a completely different picture now emerges. They not only came but also breathed new life into these places. It was the Vikings who laid the foundations of urban planning, creating orderly streets, demarcating plots, erecting churches and structures, many of which can still be seen today, testifying to their long-term influence. Surprisingly, property lines formed during the Viking Age still exist and are used today, a millennium later, which is direct proof of their significant contribution to urban development. Thus, the Vikings appear not only as warriors but also as far-sighted traders and merchants who brought new, dynamic economic life to York. From there, from already settled lands, they continued their journey westward, reaching the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, and finally Greenland. In the course of these countless voyages and the exploration of new territories, the Vikings became unsurpassed masters of seamanship and navigation. Modern researchers confidently state that these brave seafarers were capable of accurately determining latitude, following it on course, and they had a sun compass at their disposal, an indispensable tool for such calculations. It is also well known that the Vikings possessed deep knowledge of astronomy. They perfectly understood the movement of planets and stars, paying special attention to the North Star. Using this leading star, they could always accurately determine true north, which was critically important on the open sea. Of course, in any clear weather, the sun, moon, and other celestial bodies served as reliable guides. The main difficulties, it is assumed, arose during periods of prolonged bad weather, when the sky was hidden from their sight. At such times, they could lose their way, losing their bearings. However, paradoxically, it was precisely such unforeseen deviations that sometimes led to the most significant discoveries. After all, it was a lost seafarer who was the first person to see the shores of Greenland. And, even more astonishingly, according to ancient traditions, the first person to set foot on the land of Vinland, or America, also went off course during a storm while sailing from Norway to Greenland, which forever changed the course of history. The primary sources of information about those western voyages are two ancient sagas, each recounting the turbulent history of Eric the Red's lineage. This is a chronicle of discoveries, inextricably linked with violence and forced migrations. Eric's father, expelled from Norway on charges of manslaughter, was forced to move his family to Iceland. Eric himself, after a series of conflicts and killings that led to his expulsion from Iceland, set out in 986 to establish a settlement on the island he named Greenland. Over time, the colony grew, reaching several thousand inhabitants, and for centuries maintained active trade links with the European continent. Greenland was a land abundant in resources that were highly sought after in medieval Europe, from practical materials like walrus hide, indispensable for making ship ropes, to exotic and mysterious ones, such as narwhal tusk, which in medieval Europe was perceived as the mythical horn of a unicorn, an attribute of this incredibly mystical and legendary creature. However, the key export commodity remained ivory, specifically walrus ivory, obtained from the tusks of walruses inhabiting the northern waters of Greenland, which represented the main form in which tribute and various payments flowed to Europe from the Greenlanders. The Vikings' gaze was set further west, beyond the Atlantic. According to information presented in The Saga of the Greenlanders, a certain Bjarni Herjolfsson, attempting to reach Greenland, deviated from his intended course and in 986 discovered the lands of North America. He did not land but brought news of the existence of this continent back to Greenland. Around 1000 AD, Leif, the son of Eric the Red, decided to sail to the mysterious western reaches to determine if this territory was suitable for settlement. The sagas narrate that Leif's expedition first discovered a harsh and barren landscape against a backdrop of majestic mountains and glaciers. Leif named this place Helgeland, meaning land of flat stones. Modern researchers tend to believe this was Baffin Island. Moving further south, they then landed in a wooded area with a gentle shore and extensive white beaches. They named this land Markland, or Forest Land, and it was likely modern Labrador. Even further south was a third land, which they called Vinland. And it is around this place that fierce debates continue to this day. The exact location of Vinland remains a subject of discussion, known only to be somewhere south of Labrador. For many years, active discussions have continued regarding the authenticity of the sagas, the exact location of Vinland, and even the etymological meaning of the toponym Vinland itself. For example, in modern languages, the word vin, with emphasis on the I, is often associated with wine and grapes. The name Vinland was given to this land by Leif Erikson in the sagas, as he himself claimed, because of its good qualities. This assertion has since caused controversy in the scientific community, as people nowadays tend to interpret Vin as land of wine or land of grapevines. However, in Leif Erikson's time, Vikings truly had no concept of vineyards or winemaking. There was an Old Norse word vin, without emphasis, that meant pastures or meadows. And in fact, for any Scandinavian explorer discovering new land, the primary task was to find suitable grazing land for livestock. Their well-being depended on livestock. They transported their cattle on ships during expeditions, and finding a place for grazing was their highest priority. Most settlers would seek to establish themselves on land where they could maintain their accustomed way of life. In Newfoundland, for example, this was entirely possible. Their activities included hunting seals, caribou, and other game. Furthermore, it was critically important to stop in time, without moving too far, as centuries of living in northern latitudes had taught them that their winter preparation and survival depended on it. They needed to fish and prepare for the harsh winter. It was in northern Newfoundland that irrefutable evidence was finally discovered. Norwegian archaeologists, Helge Ingstad and his wife Stein Ingstad, dedicated a significant part of a decade to exploring the Atlantic coast of North America, meticulously searching for traces of Viking presence. In 1961, they reached Landsøyx Meadows. Dr. Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer, worked in tandem with his wife Stein, who was an archaeologist. They arrived at Landsøyx Meadows by chance and made contact with a local resident, Mr. George Decker. Dr. Ingstad inquired of Mr. Decker whether there were any unusual formations nearby, such as hills or mounds. Mr. Decker confirmed the presence of several indigenous encampments, for example, near Black Rock Brook, and noted that, although everything was covered in dense vegetation, it was quite evident that these were the ruins of ancient dwellings. However, he, of course, did not know who exactly built these houses. Perhaps they were built by Indians, or they were structures of outsiders. Only archaeological excavations could reveal the true background. But Dr. Ingstad himself, based on his extensive experience gained in Greenland and Western Norway, had a deep premonition that this was where Scandinavian peoples would choose to build their settlements. The Viking presence on the North American continent 500 years before Columbus's voyage is now fully confirmed at Landsøyx Meadows. The question arises, how did such a significant discovery gradually fall into oblivion, and by the time Columbus arrived, the idea of sailing to the edge of the world again captivated the minds of European explorers? The answer, likely, is that it was not forgotten at all. In 1957, Yale University acquired a very remarkable map, dated to the mid-15th century. On its western edge, a land was depicted, labeled as the island of Vinland, dating its appearance 400 years after Leif's voyage and 50 years before Columbus. If this map is authentic, it undeniably proves that the reality of transatlantic voyages still remained in the European consciousness. Part of the discussions that have unfolded around the famous Vinland map invariably touch upon the question of its genuine origin. There are suggestions that this artifact might have come from a private Spanish family library, possibly to circumvent strict Spanish regulations governing the export of antiquities. Indeed, the map raised such curious and convoluted questions that some scholars, in search of a simpler explanation, leaned towards the forgery theory. Thorough examination of the ink on the document revealed the presence of titanium oxide, a chemical substance that only became available in the 20th century. However, it was subsequently proven that the detected titanium dioxide could have entered the ink in the modern era as a result of accidental transfer during the cleaning process. It is known that in the mid-1950s, toilet paper from some manufacturers contained commercial titanium dioxide for several years, precisely the substance identified on the map. Nevertheless, there are strong reasons to believe the map is authentic. In its upper left corner, a long secret message, formatted as a cryptogram, is skillfully inscribed. The discovery of this cryptogram, as well as other inscriptions on the map, testifies to the enormous effort expended to include these encrypted messages in the text. Creating a cryptogram hidden within an inscription is impossible without extremely extensive and painstaking work, and even a single change of one word in that inscription could completely destroy the structure of the entire cryptogram. To imagine that a forger would go to such colossal efforts to embed two cryptograms and two separate inscriptions into a map seems extremely difficult. If the map is indeed authentic, it serves as irrefutable proof that the Vikings did not lose their outstanding navigational skills in the decades preceding Columbus's momentous voyages. It is known that Columbus was undoubtedly aware of the Vikings and their maritime expeditions to North America. It should be noted that Columbus was born less than 50 years after the last Viking ship sailed from Norway to Greenland. It is also well known that Columbus, as a young sailor, was in Bristol, which at that time was an important port from which many ships regularly departed for Iceland, as well as Greenland. Thus, the traditions of Viking voyages remained a living tradition. Some historical sources also indicate that Columbus visited Iceland, confirming his undoubted awareness of the existence of land across the Great Ocean. It was the Greenlanders, in essence, who discovered, or, rather, settled America. Greenland itself was colonized by settlers from Iceland. Consequently, when it comes to America being discovered by Europeans, it primarily refers to the Greenlanders who arrived from Greenland on the American continent. There is no mention of Christopher Columbus here. Indigenous Native American peoples inhabited this land long before the arrival of both Columbus and the Vikings. Thus, the Vikings were probably the first Europeans to set foot on North American soil, but their stay there was short-lived. Columbus, however, undoubtedly opened America to European civilization as a whole. Fully appreciating the scale of these historical events across centuries is extremely difficult. For example, in 1992, the elegant royal yacht Elizabeth shipwrecked during a severe storm off the coast of Spain. But, fortunately for its crew, it was luckier than its distant Viking ancestors. The people on board survived. How extraordinarily brave these ancient seafarers were. They pushed their open longships into the fjords of Scandinavia, setting sail for unknown, often hostile lands. These voyages themselves became an epic saga, writing a heroic prelude to the European Age of discovery. The question arises, will we ever learn how much Columbus owed to the Viking legacy? In 986, a Viking ship, traversing Arctic ice, rounded the coast of an unknown land. The cold waters around teemed with life. At the very edge of the known world, a Viking colony was founded in a country the settlers named Greenland. 3.5 centuries later, a European ship docked at this settlement. The sailors found the colony completely empty, abandoned, and devastated. The question of why the Viking settlers disappeared still remains a mystery. A bronze warrior serves as a symbolic harbinger of the saga's beginning. 1,000 years ago, Eric the Red led a fleet of Viking ships, departing from this Icelandic harbor westward into the unknown expanses of the sea. This is a narrative that ultimately ends in mystery. The tides of history have washed away the barely perceptible traces of human presence, leaving behind only scattered patterns that seem to lead nowhere. Time has almost completely erased the adventures of one particular man. Eric the Red was an old-school Viking, down-to-earth, wild, fiercely independent. 10 centuries ago in Norway, Eric, in a bloody battle, took the lives of several royal men. He was forced to flee to Iceland. There he found that the land was already settled. Then, as now, its inhabitants were engaged in sheep farming and fishing. They had recently adopted Christianity, and with the fervor of converts were building churches on the sacred sites of their pagan days. Information about the Old Norse faith was brutally suppressed, but Eric the Red continued to worship the Norse god Thor. In July 1978, a small group of people gathered at a secluded farm in rural western Iceland. They came to witness secret rites that had been forbidden since Eric the Red's time. Sveindbjorn Beinteinsson, a council member, revived the ancient pagan faith. His followers called him the High Priest. The return to the ancient religion of the Vikings, who appealed to spirits before battles and held lavish feasts, became a significant event for this community. The hammer symbolized the Old Norse faith. It represented lightning, a mystical sign revered in Northern Europe since prehistoric times. Then Sveindbjorn Beinteinsson, true to his convictions, guided his adherents to a secluded mountain sanctuary, located far from Iceland's busy roads and modern urban centers. Ancient Vikings, as is known, deeply revered the pristine and powerful forces of nature. The central deity in their pantheon was the Lord of the Heavens, the formidable master of storms, invariably wielding his hammer. After 10 centuries of suppression and oblivion, a ritual horn filled with mead is once again raised as an offering to mighty Thor. On the vast plain stretching in the immediate vicinity of the majestic Thingvellir waterfall, the past is celebrated and honored today. Modern Icelandic farmers gather here, just as their ancestors did in the summer of 982. And now, as 1,000 years ago, this place serves as an arena where people are judged. Free citizens once gathered here to deal with political matters, resolve disputes, and establish order. However, times relentlessly changed, and life gradually became more orderly and civilized. It was that spring that Eric's axe was again used in a bloody feud. As a result of these events, Eric the Red was outlawed, and he had to flee. He set his course west, sailing into the unknown expanses. From the northern mists, a huge island gradually emerged, bound by a thick layer of ice and seeming completely uninhabited, except for a narrow strip of land on its southwestern coast. It was here that Eric's people settled, optimistically naming their new home Greenland. They diligently made themselves at home, building dwellings and barns, fencing pastures and fields for cultivation. However, even in Greenland, Eric the Red could not find complete refuge and peace. Eric's wife built the first church on Greenlandic soil. She forbade Eric from entering their shared home until he agreed to renounce his pagan customs. Nevertheless, available evidence suggests that the old Vikings' conversion to the new faith was not complete and sincere. The fjords of Greenland proved unable to feed the growing colony. Yields were extremely low. All the wealth of this harsh land could be found exclusively in its wild nature. Small detachments of Scandinavian hunters dispersed across the vast and little explored expanses. The Arctic seas soon mercilessly destroyed their longships, but they, despite the difficulties, continued their journey in small open boats, undertaking voyages that must have lasted for years. European ships very rarely could reach such distant Greenland. Many years passed between visits. However, some Arctic treasures still lured traders to go west, overcoming vast distances. One such priceless treasure was the gerfalcon. Sultans and kings offered chests full of gold for a living Greenland gerfalcon. Arab courts and other sources informed them that this fierce and most valuable hunting bird came from the very edge of the world, from the legendary Ultima Thule, a land where Scandinavian hunters penetrated far beyond the known.